Story 1. I couldn't swim when I was a child. Someone thought it would be funny to push me into the pool. Fortunately, an adult was there and rescued me. Story 2. I woke up in a tent covered in vomit. Turns out I threw up all night in my sleep after drinking too much. I could have easily choked to death, and I am incredibly grateful that I didn't. I have never drunk that much since. Story 3. On 2 separate occasions, I narrowly dodged a head-on collision with a person veering into the wrong lane with no time to spare. Story 4. I was hit by a car as a pedestrian. I made eye contact with the driver right before he hit me. I bounced off the hood and landed on the ground. He stopped, and so did everyone else. I thought I was going to die, and people on the street who witnessed it said they thought I wasn't getting up. I only had some severe bruising, which was incredibly lucky. But our whole lives can change in a second because someone had the sun in his eyes. Story 5. My husband passed out while driving because he had tests scheduled early in the morning and he took his blood pressure medication even though he wasn't supposed to. He had pulled over when he started blacking out, and I unbuckled my seatbelt to check on him, but he pressed down on the gas. We hit a tree, which crushed the passenger side of our new car. I just had enough time to buckle my seatbelt back in or I would have died. As it was, I suffered a broken collarbone and broken ribs. It scared me so much, especially when the car caught fire and I couldn't open the door or help him. Thank goodness we had a roadside assistance service, and they dispatched help quickly. Story 6. United States Navy H-60 helicopters can be guided to the flight deck of small ships by attaching a cable between the helicopter and the ship. To do this, 2 people approach a cable lowered from a probe under the helicopter and attach it to a cable pulled up from the ship's deck. The front person is the hookup, and the second person is the safety observer. I was the hookup during one particular operation. The safety observer was not observing, and the cable wrapped around my neck just as the helicopter was taking in the assembled cables. Just before it got too tight, I was able to shake out of the wrap, which ripped off my protective helmet, and I ran off the deck. Thankfully, I only sustained a couple of nicked earlobes. Story 7. I've had many experiences, honestly. The closest one? I was crash-carted in an operating room. I had a defibrillator and chest compressions. I experienced everything that time. I think I met Jesus, who introduced himself as Michael, the Archangel. I told him I had unfinished business and then woke up. Apparently, I had been in a coma. The surgery I had was called an endoscopic third ventriculostomy. A piece of debris fell onto my optic nerve. I had a seizure in the middle of this intense surgery and survived. I have about 10 other crazy experiences, but that was probably the closest to dying I've ever been, so far. I haven't had an easy life, but I'm here and surviving. Edit. I died and lived. Yes, I'm a zombie. The pearly gates moment was definitely a delusion or hallucination. It was crazy no matter what. Story 8. I was crossing the street and got hit by a drunk driver in a lifted Ford F-250. The impact launched me across 4 lanes and sent my shoes flying in the other direction. Adrenaline helped me crawl out of traffic, but everyone had already stopped. An off-duty nurse who witnessed the accident kept me from going too much farther into shock. The driver considered fleeing but decided to turn around and check on me. It turned out it was his second driving under the influence offense. I landed on my elbows, ankles, and knees, and I still have deep scars on my elbows. My back and neck never fully recovered, but fortunately, I am well enough to live actively and just pretend I am not in constant pain. My legal settlement barely covered my medical expenses along with a couple of months of physical therapy. My lawyer said that since it was only soft tissue damage, the settlement wouldn't be substantial, as broken bones usually yield higher payouts, despite soft tissue and ligament damage taking much longer to heal. To this day, I can still hear the sound of the diesel engine playing against a freeze frame of the front quarter of the truck that struck me. The biggest takeaway was hearing a voice in my head at the moment of impact that was not my own, saying, "Not yet." I was never one to believe much in divinity, but since then, I have become more receptive to the idea that someone was looking out for me and that I still have a purpose or task to complete in this life. Story 9. My oncologist told me, before starting treatment, that I may only have a year left. That was late October 2013. Story 10. I found out I was allergic to sunflower seeds and went into anaphylactic shock. I was losing consciousness at the hospital. Story 11. When I was a few years old, my family went to a park by a river, and there is a 50% chance that I fell in and my dad had to save me. I mention this because, to this day, he doesn't remember if it was me or my sister who fell into the river. Story 12. A car crash at 70 to 80 miles per hour flipped over multiple times. Everything in my life froze after the initial topple of the vehicle. I was lucky to regain consciousness and escape unharmed as if nothing had happened. Story 13. I had appendicitis. The hospital was kind of ignoring me, saying I was fine. After 3 days of severe pain while on morphine, I literally screamed at them to take me into surgery today or I was going to die, and they listened. As they were opening me up, my appendix burst. The surgeon said had I not gone in the minute I did, I would be dead. Story 14. 2 instances come to mind. In the first, I was extremely underweight and required a defibrillator and medication as my pulse dropped below 20 beats per minute. In the second, I accidentally swallowed a razor blade and needed surgery to have it removed. Story 15. Thrown off a boat going 70 miles per hour. I had the wind knocked out of me and 2 of my ribs cracked. Thank goodness for life jackets. Story 16. As teenagers, we drove off a cliff. Emergency responders believed we caused the accident and detained us because they thought no one could have survived that crash. We climbed out of the gully using the upturned tree roots, without a scratch, and encountered the first responders. When we returned the next day to retrieve the alcohol we left in the car, we noticed graves scattered around the impact site. Story 17. Several times, mostly due to traffic issues, my father tried to abandon me deep in the woods. Once, I dove 7 to 8 meters down to the ocean floor a little way out from the beach. The water pressure reduced my buoyancy, and I felt stuck to the ocean bottom. I managed to rise back up by using my legs to push myself upwards as quickly as possible. Story 18. Heart rate was down to 19 when I was in the emergency room, which was very scary. I was diagnosed with congestive heart failure and received a pacemaker. Story 19. I choked on ramen when I was sick. My lips started to turn blue, and the paramedics showed up. Thankfully, my parents are retired nurses, so the paramedics were not needed once they arrived and ensured I was alive. Story 20. I overdosed on junk because it contained fentanyl, which I wasn't aware of. They said I was dead for a little while, but I don't remember any of it. Story 21. Our house had a trapdoor that led to the basement. The door was open because our washing machine was there, and my mom was doing laundry. I was running through the house and didn't realize the door was open. I spent a week at Riley Hospital for Children and had a month off from school. Story 22. We went to Branson, Missouri, for vacation when I was about 6 or 7 years old. We went water tubing with the sled being pulled by a boat. I was supposed to be with an adult on the sled, but I thought going alone would be a good idea. Within about 12 seconds, I fell off and went 15 feet underwater, my eyes wide open. I remember how dark and scary it was to this day. This was also the reason I still have thalassophobia. I was pretty far away from the boat, if I had to guess, maybe 10 to 20 feet away. My friend had to swim all the way to rescue me. All the information is pretty fuzzy, considering this happened around 2016. Story 23. I went over a low dam on the Cuyahoga River with a group of friends. I got caught in the hydraulic current and thought, is this it? As I kept pushing myself off the bottom. I eventually surfaced, much to the amusement of my friends, completely naked. 3 days later, everyone who went in the water fell ill with gastrointestinal issues. Story 24. I have a couple of incidents to share. When I was 18, I was playing football and jumped to head the ball from across. I felt something sharp hit my head, landed, and blood started pouring from my wound. It turned out that some kids had been playing with their father's air rifle, and I happened to jump at the perfect moment to get shot in the head. Doctors said if I had been 2 centimeters higher, it probably would have hit my temple. A couple of years ago, I picked up a glass vase incorrectly, and it snapped in my hand, resulting in a deep cut on my wrist. That was frightening, as there was a lot of blood in the downstairs area. The doctors mentioned that it was close to a main artery, though I am not sure how close. Story 25. Microseconds make the difference. I was traveling on a wet highway, just going over a bridge at 100 kilometers per hour, when a truck was coming in the opposite direction at the same speed. A large bale of hay lifted into the air and struck the front of my car, hitting the grill. I could see it coming, so I removed my feet from the pedals, held the steering wheel tightly, and braced for impact. A microsecond difference could have resulted in the bale coming through my windshield, likely resulting in my death. A poor decision might have led me to hit the brakes and end up in the river far below. Story 26. It wasn't actually close, but it felt close. I was working at 222 Broadway on September 11th, maybe 200 to 300 yards from the North Tower. My office windows faced the towers. I was close enough to feel both impacts, and the collapse of the towers felt like an earthquake. I thought I was going to die, as I'm sure many others did. Story 27. So many moments. My guardian angel is working overtime. The two significant ones: crossing the road while walking home in elementary school. A bus ran a red light, and I was literally 1 or 2 steps away from being hit. I swerved into oncoming traffic accidentally when I was a new driver. Fortunately, no accident occurred, and no one was injured, but I definitely scared my mom and myself. This isn't exactly near death, but I used to ride my bike around the neighborhood all the time as a kid. There was a delivery driver making his rounds, and I decided to talk to him. We chatted for a while. I can't remember what we discussed. He let me hang out in his truck for a bit, and I climbed into the back to explore. Turned out he was just a nice man doing his job. After a while, we went our separate ways. Looking back now, I realize how reckless that was and how easily I could have been kidnapped. Thankfully, he was a good person. Story 28. 8 years ago, I tried to swallow an entire bottle of antidepressants with a few swigs of alcohol. At that time, I wanted to die, which was a huge mistake. I blacked out. All I remember is having nightmares and visions, along with vomiting for a day until it was all blood. I also experienced severe headaches and hallucinations for a couple of days afterward. I couldn't distinguish what was real, and it was very frightening. I am glad to report that I am healthy and have never attempted suicide again or taken any more antidepressants. Story 29. Falling asleep while driving on a sharp corner of the highway after a night of 10 hours of sleep was alarming. I woke up just in time to prevent crashing. Soon after, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. It turns out that not only did I almost die in the crash, but I was also slowly dying due to the undiagnosed disease. The crash gave me driving anxiety, which expedited my diagnosis. So what almost killed me ultimately ended up saving me. Story 30. I had a severe asthma attack when I was 10. Luckily, it was loud enough to wake my parents so they could take me to the emergency room. Story 31. I was a conductor student for a Class 1 railroad. We were out in a rural area switching out some cars. I needed to go between the cars and make a hose so the rest of the cars we were picking up could receive air and we could perform our brake test. As I prepared, I asked the engineer over the radio for an in-between, indicating that I would like to go between the cars attached to the engine. All I heard was muffled noise, so I paused for a moment. There was no movement and complete radio silence. I looked at my conductor, and he shrugged, so I keyed the radio again asking, "Did you say, wham?" The cars I was about to crouch down under and in between smashed by. If I had taken his muffled response as confirmation, I would have been killed or, at the very least, missing limbs. Story 32. Being intubated after a severe asthma attack was a frightening experience. The last thing I remember was telling my mother on the way to the ambulance, "I think I am going to lose control." Next thing I knew, I woke up 4 days later, restrained by my wrists and with a tube down my throat. My heart had stopped, and they had to restart it. They were unsure if I would suffer permanent brain damage. The most uncomfortable feeling was having that tube pulled out. I have a damaged voice box from it, so now my voice is permanently hoarse. It was truly terrifying. I have been intubated 3 times due to asthma attacks, but this was the only time my heart actually stopped. Story 33. Middle Eastern wars and conflicts occurred in 1996, 2002, 2009, 2014, and currently from 2023 to 2025. There was a knife fight in Russia involving robbers. Additionally, there is a mention of colon cancer. Story 34. I experienced severe complications after my C-section, which resulted in an incision extending 6 inches across my abdomen and 7 inches deep, reaching my intestines. I lost 3 liters of blood on the bathroom floor. Breathing was physically painful, making it difficult to communicate with emergency services. At that time, my baby was just 1 week old, and I had only held him for the first time that day. I truly believed I might not survive. Story 35. I was in a car accident with my friend. A car was coming straight at us from the oncoming traffic, and the police said that if we hadn't moved that extra inch over when we did, the windshield would have been blown into our faces, and we could have died from the car nose-diving into the windshield. Story 36. I have a couple of stories. When I was 18, I was playing football and jumped to head the ball from across. I felt something sharp hit my head. Then I landed and blood started pouring out. Turned out some kids had been playing with their dad's air rifle, and I happened to jump at the perfect moment to get shot in the head. Doctors said that if I had been 2 centimeters higher, it probably would have hit my temple. Secondly, a couple of years ago, I picked up a glass vase incorrectly, and it snapped in my hand, slicing my wrist open. That was scary. There was a lot of blood all over the downstairs area. The doctors mentioned that I was close to a main artery, but they were not sure how close. Story 37. I got stuck in a riptide when I was 9 at the beach. I managed to get out before a massive wave pulled me under, and I ended up blacking out before waking up on a towel. It's really scary thinking back on it. Story 38. I almost died over the weekend. My wife feeds our puppy these horrible all-natural treats. The puppy absolutely hates them and won't eat them. So, I hid a bag of bacon strips in the cabinet above the fridge. My wife decided to clean the fridge this weekend and pulled everything out. The whole time, she was 18 inches from the highly illegal dog treats. When my wife went to the bathroom, I ran full speed to the kitchen, rescued the treats, and ran off to the garage. The secret remains. The puppy has her secret snacks. Had my wife opened the cabinet door, I would have been hacked to death with a very blunt instrument, and the puppy would still be getting goat's milk and rock-hard oats. My life flashed before my eyes. I have never been so close to death. Story 39. I got caught in a riptide when I was around 13. I had never heard of one, much less encountered it. I remember a man who reminded me of Pierce Brosnan pulled me to safety before I could get into too much danger. Story 40. My sister and I went on all-terrain vehicles in Mexico. It was after a tequila tasting when we were driving back. She made a wrong move and I went flying out from behind. She caught me with one hand, barely in time. I was hanging off a 30-foot cliff. I will never go again. Story 41. I attempted suicide when I was 13. I jumped off a roof and broke my leg. I wasn't close to dying, but I would say that is the closest I've ever been. Story 42. I almost drowned swimming off Catalina Island. I used to swim outside the break when I was a kid, and my wife and I were on Catalina for a week. Our condo overlooked Hamilton Cove, and there were buoys in the small harbor. I had been eyeing them for a few days, and one day after drinking on the beach, I said I was going to swim around one and come back. About halfway out, I passed some tourists in a kayak, and they asked if I was okay. I stupidly said yes and kept swimming as the buoy was right there, just 15 feet away. Seeing it off in the distance, I thought that since it was so close, there was no reason to stop. I dragged my fingertips around it as I rounded it and headed back. At this point, I was winded but still doing okay. The water was rough, but nothing I hadn't swum in before. We have snorkeled in some pretty rough waters in the Caribbean, but of course, at those times, we had fins, which would have been a game changer. About 3/4 of the way back, my head started to go under as I swam, but I never ingested water, thankfully. I stopped and treaded water momentarily to tell my wife this was a mistake. She was in about waist-deep water, 25 feet or so closer to shore. I started swimming again, And it's true, your life flashes before your eyes. I had so many memories rush back in the split second I decided to either stand up or sink. The water was about chest high, thankfully. I am 6 feet 5 inches tall, and honestly, that is what made the difference. Story 43. Once, when I was riding my bike, a badger ran in front of me as I was going 80 miles per hour, and I hit it straight on. I could see that there were many trees on both sides of the road, so I aimed to slide along the road instead. Miraculously, I managed to stay upright even though my handlebars went full lock a couple of times. I was really lucky. I stopped and went back, but the animal was dead, so I pushed it into the ditch. I was shaking the whole ride home after that. The only damage to my bike was the front fender, which was cracked on both sides, and I had to replace it. Story 44. I was at a summer camp in France with a large group. After an excursion, we had to wait for everyone before boarding the train. It turned out the train we missed was involved in a fatal crash, resulting in several deaths and injuries. I was in the group that would have boarded that train, but I'm grateful our camp counselors decided to wait. After we boarded the next train, we experienced numerous delays and needed to be picked up. Everyone was confused, annoyed, and tired after a full day of activities. It wasn't until we reached the camp that the counselors pulled me and a few others aside to explain the situation. Since we were the oldest campers, I was 17, they instructed us to call our parents and assure them that we were safe and unharmed. Story 45. I was on my way to work one morning. It was still dark out and I was running late. For some reason, I decided to pass the car in front of me, even though we were approaching a hill. I came within feet, if not inches, of a head-on collision with a vehicle in its correct lane, narrowly making it back into my lane. I felt bad for years about that close call I made in 2008. I could have ended at least 2 lives. Story 46. 5-hour energy, workout, sinus medication, and no water resulted in an ambulance being called due to erratic heart rhythms and a dropping body temperature. 5-hour energy is dangerous and its effects can last more than 5 hours. Story 47. On my 15th birthday, I was jaywalking, something we always did on that street when going to the convenience store. 2 lanes of traffic were stopped at the red light, but the right turn only lane still had cars coming, which I didn't notice. A car was approaching that lane a little fast as I stepped in front of it. The driver slammed on the brakes 2 feet away from hitting me. That would have been my last birthday. Now I am in my 50s. Story 48. All of a sudden, I did not feel well. Long story short, I found out I had stage 4 cancer. I went downhill extremely fast. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't even sit or function. They rushed me into chemotherapy, and here I am, in no pain and feeling much better. Story 49. When I was in 4th grade, I fell from a tree after the branch I was holding broke. If I had landed a few more degrees to my right, I would have been paralyzed. If I had landed a few more degrees on my head, I would have been dead. Believe in God or not, but everyone who saw it said, angels were carrying you on the way down. Story 50. Hit by a semi on the 10 outside of Los Angeles. A state trooper came and said he expected to see fatalities when he was informed that a semi-truck had hit a compact car on the highway. Story 51. I had a very serious blood clot in my leg that the hospital initially diagnosed as cellulitis, but did not advise me to stop taking my estrogen birth control. They were confused when I returned and was still in extreme pain. Then they thinned my blood significantly, putting me at risk of bleeding out if I encountered any trauma. Ironically, my mother had surgery about a year later, and the same hospital also misdiagnosed her blood clot as bronchitis. The only reason I knew to request an ultrasound for a blood clot was due to my experience and her symptoms being so similar to mine. Story 52. I almost drowned at times, but the main issue was that I stopped eating when I was 18 months old. Not just candy, cookies, or ice cream, nothing at all. I was hospitalized for weeks before I began to recover. Without modern medicine, I would have died. I was on intravenous nutrition for a while and grew up with a severe needle phobia. I have experienced digestive problems my entire life, but I am alive. Story 53. At 21, I experienced a gallstone blockage that resulted in severe acute pancreatitis, which has a mortality rate of approximately 20%. Emergency surgery was quite challenging. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.